What's going on, guys? Ben here, and today we're going to be discussing Flintlock Siege of Dawn. This action souls-like RPG just came out recently, and I was very kindly provided a key to take a look at it and give my honest thoughts on the game. I've managed to complete it 100%, see all the game has to offer and go through all that different stuff, so sit back, relax, and let's jump into it. The Flintlock Siege of Dawn comes from A44 Games, who made a game I played a while back called Ashen. This is labelled as an explosive souls-lite, and although there are a few nods to the Souls genre, this felt more like God of War or the recent Banishes game from Don't Nod in terms of its combat and exploration. That said, sadly I feel Flintlock does fall a bit short in comparison to both these titles, which we'll dig into, but there was some enjoyable moments here for sure. In Flintlock, you play and control Nor Vanak, a sapper in this fantasy universe where it's got that Napoleonic Empire vibe going on, mixed with magic, the undead, and some rather unpleasant gods. In this world, the opening sequence sees you accidentally unleash the gods from the great below, and they start taking over the land. You team up with a fox god called Enki, who for some reason is happy to help you get revenge and take the gods down one by one. These serve as the main bosses and story checkpoints throughout the game. The titular weapon, the Flintlock, is your primary firearm alongside your trusty sapper axe, and as you progress through the story, of which there are two main areas and a couple of smaller spaces to explore, you'll find new weapons, upgrades, and ways to fight and more. So let's start with the combat and address the difficulty, as it does have a souls-lite tag. I think it is a bit of a steep curve at the beginning, where a few enemies at once can overwhelm you or cause some problems here and there while you get into grips with the systems and everything like that. But for the most part, on normal difficulty, it was a challenge that got easier as you got further in and upgraded your gear and skills. It has the bonfire system where enemies respawn when you rest, but resting replenishes your health flasks and your consumables such as grenades. The Flintlock acts as a combat mechanic to halt unblockable attacks where the enemies shine red. You must either avoid these or use your Flintlock to stun the enemy, as blocking will not work in these instances. The Flintlock kind of just recharges on its own as well, so you don't actually need to pick up any ammo for that or anything. Basically doing melee combat or just combat in general will recharge your Flintlock charges. For other attacks, your block and parry, if timed correctly, work here, and I didn't find it too unforgiving. I'm not the best Souls player by any means. There is a story mode difficulty where you don't earn achievements, but it does considerably lower the difficulty, as well as a harder possessed difficulty where the enemies I found were just downright abusive. Not my kind of fun there, as it does seem to drag fights on more so than anything else. It's just buffing health and damage received rather than any new mechanics. The combat sees you blending your axe and Flintlock combat with Enki's abilities, where you can command him to distract enemies, inflict curses and other debuffs, and can sync your attacks with his to get bonus damage dealt. I did really like that aspect of it. Felt more of a useful companion than just a companion for story's sake. The whole combat itself, along with the progression, is then built around the reputation score, which is the XP you earn in combat and objectives, but there's a multiplier. And the multiplier system is this risk-reward mechanism where the more various things you do in combat and increase the multiplier, you can then choose to bank the XP earned with the multiplier affecting it at any time. But if you don't, and you get hit or take damage in any way, the multiplier disappears and you just get the base XP like normal. Personally, I had a love-hate relationship with the multiplier. If you're looking to get all the unlocks and upgrades, I would say it's not really an optional system, and it is something you're going to have to try and focus on. Some enemies just seem hell-bent or just purely designed to just ruin your multiplier as opposed to anything else. Sometimes felt a little bit cheesy in that regard. On the flip side, it did make me take more consideration when going into a fight with enemies, as a higher multiplier did raise the stakes. You know, do I bank the 1000 XP plus a 50% multiplier now? Or do I risk getting hit and that 1000 just gets banked on its own and I've missed out on 500 XP there that could have been free? I think fans of the Souls genre who want a harder challenge will enjoy this mechanic, as it does kind of incentivize this no-hit playthrough or attempt, so you can bank as much XP as possible. If you die during combat, you'll return to the last camp or lodestone that you stopped off at, and you have to then trek back to pick up your reputation that was left on the floor where you died, which again, quite common in these Souls-like games. Generally, these respawns were quite numerous and fairly placed throughout the areas though, so I never felt too hard done by, or that I was like trekking through 10-15 minutes of gameplay to get back to where I was. It was only ever a minute or two to kind of get back to where I died, and then I could just pick up my stuff again. And as mentioned, I would say as you start to get to around the halfway point of the game on normal difficulty, you've been doing all the side quests as you go, which also give you XP and mean you can upgrade your skills and everything like that. I found the game started to become much easier after that point, as Nor starts to get more and more powerful with her abilities. Now at the camps, you can spend resources that you would find around the world, as well as your reputation XP to upgrade various weapons you find from the tier 1 all the way to tier 6. each one getting more expensive as you go. Word of warning, there isn't really enough resources in a playthrough to upgrade everything, as although reputation is farmable depending on the time you put in, the resources around the world, which is mainly the wood, iron and sulfur, they seem to be finite. I couldn't get them to respawn, and there's also no new game plus or anything, so once the credits roll, that's done. For Nor herself, she obviously has her skill tree, which is broken up into the 3 different areas, which is the Flintlock, Enki's magic, and then her kind of sword melee kind of combat focused. And as you then upgrade and spend reputation in these points, you'll then unlock either further abilities or passive abilities that will kind of just buff you in general as well. I did quite like this, and there's a little bit of a synergy between them as well as you kind of overlap from Enki's into the Flintlock. There'll be like kind of hybrid skills that were benefiting from both of them and stuff like that. So the game consists of 2 main playing spaces. You've got the Three Peaks and Wanderer's Rest, which they serve a fairly linear path in an open world hub space. For those that have played Gears of War 4 and 5, it felt a little bit like that, where you can explore and find like quests, side quests and tunnels or caves to explore, but the story is pushing you through the area as you follow the main story. Visually, these areas, both fairly distinct from one another, were nice to explore, and you can tell a lot of effort went into crafting these spaces from a visual standpoint. From a level design standpoint, it's got the white paint for climbable areas that we're used to seeing in games these days, and it does have some odd level design in terms of it's built in mind by the game devs for you to be platforming and jumping, but at the same time it's meant to be like a space that's livable, and you're kind of thinking, well, how did the NPCs or even the enemies, how do the enemies get up here in the first place, you know, and stuff like that. It's kind of just built of platforming in certain areas, so you're actually doing quite a lot of jumping and flying and double jumping and grabbing and stuff like that. You've got the dodge mechanic, which not only is used in combat, but the dodge is actually used quite a lot in the platforming, so to give you that kind of extra reach. So it felt a bit odd that it's like built with that in mind. You're climbing in these towers where you can make the jump because of your powers, but like how the enemies are getting there in the first place and stuff like that, that's the bit that doesn't really make sense, and it's kind of then feels a bit more video gamey than it probably was meant to feel like. Throughout the areas, there are some collectibles to find, quests to complete, but mainly, like I said, you're moving from one point to the next. There's a small side quest that takes you to a separate location briefly, as well as the final area, which is much smaller and sets up the end of the game. Most of my footage here is between the first space, Three Peaks, and a bit of the second place, Wanderer's Rest, as I didn't want to spoil too much in this review. Sadly, for a game that requires you to do a lot of platforming and exploring, it never really feels that great to do these things. You can tell the jumping climbing animation is a bit floaty. It's trying to snap you to a ledge to grab, and always feels a little bit jarring when that happened, which was rather frequently. The exploring was very much on the rails as mentioned, and although on the one hand there wasn't hundreds of quest markers and towers to climb like in a Ubisoft game, a lot of the world isn't really interactable. It's just props and villages, and you quickly realize what feels like a living world actually just feels like you're just passing through, and it's very static. The rift travel, which is how you fly through the air or unlock shortcuts to areas you've been to via Enki, is fun to begin with. I would say it does start to wear off. There's really not too much expanded upon here, and it just serves as kind of a mini travel system to get from one place to another quickly when it's available. I feel like this was best played on controller as well. I couldn't get on with the mouse and keyboard, and I feel like this follows the trend of these style of games where they're designed with controller in mind firstly, as it did feel somewhat better playing on a controller for the combat and the movement. Although either method, I found the auto-locking targeting to just be poor and frustrating most of the time, which is annoying when you do have quite a few enemies surrounding you. So the gods serve as milestones in the stories, and you'll fight them as bosses as you move through the world. These were actually quite fun, and some good music to go with them as well, which we'll discuss in the sound part. But I actually found the bosses rather easy, which if anyone knows me and my ability with souls-like games, that is something I wouldn't expect to say. Obviously you get stronger as you progress, but the bosses were more manageable at times than some of the groups of enemies I'd come across out in the world exploring. It was nice from a power point of view and moving through the story, as I wasn't left frustrated dying to a boss the 10th time of trying. In fact, only the first boss I actually died a few times on, while I was still figuring the game out and the mechanics and how to parry and everything. The last 3 bosses I did in one life. Like, I did not die in those boss fights at all, and had no issues whatsoever, I think, from a challenge point of view. So if you're a Dark Souls or like an Elden Ring veteran, then the harder difficulty may be the option for you. But like I said, this isn't a game that's got tons and tons of bosses that are like littered around and stuff like that. I'd say there was 1 or 2 that could be counted as like kind of like a hidden boss of sorts. which weren't gods. They were just, you could stumble across them as kind of like a mini side quest. And then you've got the main bosses, which were, like I said, very straightforward. So I'll discuss the story without spoilers as much as possible. I feel like this one grew more interesting as you get further into it. I think the opening act in the first few hours didn't really do enough to pull me in. I found Nor, the main character, quite unlikable as well as the supporting cast, bar one or two characters, and you do kind of get thrown into this world, and the explanation of what's going on is just because it is. And thankfully I did enjoy Enki's character. He's your companion, and it does create a nice back and forth between him and Nor, brings her character out of the shell a little bit, and you can kind of see as the story starts picking up and goes further, it becomes more interesting, at least in my opinion. I'm starting to get more and more invested the longer I was playing it. Overall, is this top level writing and storytelling? I don't think so. It was a fun action adventure story with some nice moments. Started very slow, but there was a lot to be desired when it comes to character development and the overall plot, as it started so shaky as well. I was glad to reach the end and see the conclusion to wrap up the story, so to speak, but I wouldn't say it's highly memorable or something that stands out above and beyond. Completing the game on normal while grinding a little bit of reputation and resources for upgrades to get all the achievements, I took just under 24 hours to complete it. That includes a bit of time testing the harder difficulty and getting footage and stuff like that too. And for a AA game, it's got a £30 price point. I would say that's a little bit obviously over £1 per hour of gameplay. I personally don't see any replayability once you've done this and complete the story. There's no challenge modes, there's no new game plus, there's no extra bits or anything you can do afterwards. You just start a new save and you can do it on a harder difficulty if you want. And there's no rewards or benefits for doing that from what I could see either. You just get to suffer a little bit more and say you've done it. The good news is that the game is on Game Pass, so if you have a Game Pass subscription, this is an easy recommend to pick it up, try it, see if it's for you. If you're looking to buy this from a £30 asking point, personally with the odd bugs and crashes here and there as well, I would recommend it in a sale at the moment. If you can pick this up for £15–20, then I think that's a bit more bang for your buck. So, mentioned some bugs and crashes there, so let's talk about the technical performance. So, I'm playing on a 12900K with an RTX 4090, I was playing at 4K, I was getting a fair few crashes when settings were on Ultra with DLSS on. Knocking it down to high meant I could get the 4K 144 FPS with occasional crash. Hats off to the autosave system though, because you literally just crash or close the game and you'll load back up right where you were. Seems like it's autosaving every 5 seconds or so. So I never had to run back or like redo like 20 minutes of like stuff that I'd already done. Like literally pretty much where it crashed, I just reloaded the game and I was right there. So that was quite impressive in something at least. As mentioned, I think the game has some nice environments, but nothing too jaw-dropping that it should be really pushing my rig to 4K high or ultra and be struggling with that. There's certainly prettier games that run better, and it's definitely got some optimization issues on that side of things. Certainly on Steam Deck, I can't recommend this. So if you're only on Steam Deck and you're looking to pick this up, I can get this to run very well at all. Many times dropping to 20 or below. That's everything on low settings, 800p. There wasn't any FSR. There was only the Intel's XeSS. When I tested that, I don't know if they've patched FSR in or not since. And obviously DLSS isn't available on the Steam Deck. So it just wasn't something that was enjoyable to look at or play on the Steam Deck. Despite the controller support and stuff, I thought this would be a good one for that, but sadly not. So for sound and audio, the music was really nice in places. You could tell a lot of effort went into composing, making the soundtrack for this. Boss fight music was hyped as well. It did a really good job of setting the tone and being present without being overbearing, which I feel all good soundtracks should be doing. That said, it's let down by the mix. This game has dreadful mixing and audio direction, whether that's NPC chatter, whether that's combat cues or anything like that, all just merges and mushes together. It can sound like enemies or even NPCs are having conversations that sounds like it's right next to you, but they're either like far behind you or to the right of you. It seems like audios trigger locally on Nor, on the character, rather than the source. So directionally, it's all over the place. It feels weird, jarring at times, hard to tell, especially when enemies are in a group, as the camera is quite close for the combat. And we don't have the best targeting system either. And so the amount of times I got hit in the back because the audio cues were like missing or from the wrong direction entirely did cause a few frustrations. Voice acting, I would say, was okay. Nothing to write home about, nothing amazing. I felt Enki's voice actor did well and had a decent gravitas with his voice and conveying his emotions. I feel her character was held back by the development and writing. And And so that was always going to be a struggle there anyway. Overall, it was okay. Overall, I enjoyed my time with Flintlock Siege of Dawn, albeit with smatterings of frustration from time to time. Whether that be clunkiness in the movement, audio issues, or the odd crash here and there, it was a fun story in the end and a nice game to play through that didn't overstay its welcome. I think there's questions around the price point, as although it's clearly a AA title, it has basically no replayability whatsoever. And so it's hard to recommend a full price £33.50. And so if you can, I would pick this up on Game Pass and try it there. Or if you don't have Game Pass, I'd recommend waiting for a sale and picking it up with at least 30% off. There were some good ideas here in Flintlock, but sadly not all of them landed. And I think it's a mixed match of ideas and scope that have clashed at times. And sometimes that's created some awesome moments and mechanics in the game. But other times I feel like it's held the title back. Certainly not a bad game, but it's not a great game either. Not that I do scores usually, but this is like the perfect example of like a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10. It's good, it lacks a bit of value for money, it's rough around the edges, but it's by no means terrible. And although it shares some ideas of God of War, Banishers, Gears of War, as mentioned earlier, it doesn't really come close to any of their heights that those games in particular reached. Anyway, that's all from me. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you tried this out? If you found this video helpful, please consider dropping a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.